Right.
Okay. But Tunisha, the signal seems good
Yeah, so far.
for Kyle.
Mhm.
Good. When was it we had a kind of a shaky? That was
It's freaking me out. Right. That one, I hear myself.
all right. I'm going to tweet out the link.
Okay.
You guys are now live, just FYI.
Ah.
And I'm going to go back to here.
So resist saying anything offensive or horrible that will get you fired from your jobs right now.
I don't know. We're going to talk about wrestling.
Yeah.
Ah. If they're gonna fire me for that, then I'd already be gone. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Here is the live link.
So
All
your
righty.
classes are all done, right, Mike?
Yeah. So end of last week I submitted final grades, so
Cool.
we're done for the semester now.
Okay, cool.
All righty. I'm back. Welcome to Writing and Fighting. It is March.
Yeah.
Time. It is May 22nd, 2020. And I'm very excited to be having a class where we really dig in to wrestling, pro wrestling and literature. And I feel like I have the foremost authority in that world with us today, Mike Chen, you've had 3 collections, numerous stories, you've poems that go along with this. I just listened to some of your podcasts. We'll talk about that. That is goes along. It's actually like auxiliary to your new book. I'm going to introduce you in a second, but as always, we have friends of Writing and Fighting, my esteemed colleagues. Tunisha, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Tunisha. I'm a professor at Fielding Graduate University in the Department of Psychology, where I earned my PhD in media psychology. And I'm really just interested in that intersection between media consumption and human behavior. I'm fascinated by the human experience, and I focused predominantly most of my research on sports, and that being sports entertainment. I looked at pro wrestling because I really believe that should have a seat at the table when it comes to the intersection of how digital media was integrated into how it is a mirror often to society, how it can prompt different movements, and how society and pro wrestling kind of just have this double Dutch play with each other. I'm fascinated by that. And so I always, when Nancy told me, that this was that you were coming on, Mike, I was like, hell yeah. So that's kind of like, I don't know, short bit about me and why I'm here. But thank you for having me as always, Nancy.
Always. Kyle.
So I am a professor of sociology at SUNY Brockport. So I live up in Western New York in Rochester. And a great deal of my research is around how people create meaning and studying culture through looking at physical practice. So I've published on mixed martial arts and look at how people train and tell stories within that site. And then I've also published at looking at the intersection of sports and politics. So recently, Nancy and I co-authored something looking at the UFC's return to action. I've also looked at the NFL, and I'm working currently looking at the NBA and political action. And then Mike and I we're in the same undergraduate honors program at SUNY Geneseo. So as we were talking, I think right when you were starting the recording, it's been a long time, but it was exciting. I didn't know that you took this path until a few years ago when you published some of your first books. I saw this and I was like, wow, this is something we should have been talking about through these years as we took kind of parallel, interesting paths.
Yes, Kyle, I think you should partner with Mike about, wrestling and what's going on with that industry.
Yeah, and I know nothing about professional wrestling. So that's also exciting because I had a period when I was young where I paid a little bit of attention. I've seen parallels where MMA and pro wrestling intersect. So I'm really fascinated to hear your take on culture and how you've entered the space.
Exactly. And just to introduce myself as well, I'm Nancy Kidder. I'm a professor in literature at American University, where I teach a course called Writing and Fighting about the literature of combat sports. And, I am actually very excited, and you'll have to forgive me, Mike, because I was a boxing girl. Then I found MMA. Pro wrestling has been, kind of that cousin that I need to talk to, but I don't pick up the phone because I'm like, oh, it's so different. But I have to tell you, reading your work has opened up some rabbit holes for me. You know, I watched The Dark Side of the Moon at like 5 a.m, and now Owen Hart, I had to like go with him, and I didn't know how many pile drivers you could have. I am raptured. So please forgive me if I ask kind of basic questions because of navigation, but I really love how you've translated this into a literary form and found the significance. So first, let me introduce Mike Chen. We know where he went to undergrad. He also is an alum of the MFA program in the prestigious creative writing at Oregon State and has an MA at Johns Hopkins University. You are the author of 3 full-length books. You Might Forget the Sky Was Ever Blue, you Circus Folk, and most recently, The Long Way Home by Cowboy Jamboree Press, just released in January or March?
So March is the official date we say. I think it was officially available on sale in February, sort of a muddy timeline, but yeah, in that ballpark.
Right when the world is a pandemic, not the easiest to do a book tour.
Yeah.
So I understand, but let me tell you, quarantine reading, please read this, The Long Way Home. And you also paired this because you do a podcast called Stories on Stories, which is really interesting. You do them like once a month. And you also did a pairing of The Short Way Home, which I found really amazing because it's like talking to someone, if you really wanted to know about WrestleMania 37, or is that 2010 when you had The Undertaker versus Heartbreak Kid? See, I know this.
You sound like you know. You sound like you know wrestling.
Yeah, 25. Yeah.
I didn't know this last week, but I'm telling you. But you get to sit with someone who describes like what the crowd size, what's going on, the feelings, the emotions, right? And that's something I think we all recognize from combat sports is what we connect to, and the storyline. Mike, I really want to know, and I'm curious, you know, the Long Way Home, which is a series, and they're stories that you've published previously, and then put this in this collection. Can you tell me about what inspired your desire to write about pro wrestling, and even just your inspiration to be a writer?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. That's a lot of great questions bundled into one set there. I guess I'll say, I mean, I think my path as a wrestling fan, as a writer, are pretty parallel to each other because they're both most of my life. I was a little kid and I liked writing before I liked reading. And so I was, sort of writing stories about dragons and just really derivative of anything that I was reading at the time, for my, late elementary school years through middle school into high school. And I was a wrestling fan pretty much as long as I can remember. Some of my first memories are watching one of those big bulky plastic VHS tapes of WrestleMania 4. And so, it's kind of been a part of my life. And I think, as much as, Kyle even mentioned, not being a wrestling fan, still, having a period in his life when he paid some attention to it. And I think that we're kind of that perfect generation where we were little kids when like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage were such a big deal. And then we were teenagers when Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock were a big deal. So in case you were going to lapse your fanhood, like there was every opportunity to kind of jump back in and, kind of be invested in it. And then I just stuck with it. I think that's sort of the more unusual part. I think, as a kid who was not at all athletic, who never got into fights or anything, it was really far removed from my reality, but I think it just sort of captured my imagination for those purposes. And so I think as I tried to be kind of taken seriously as a creative writer, it's something I sort of steered away from. It was kind of my dirty little secret. And, when I was, in college and early in grad school, I kind of avoided, letting anyone know that I was a wrestling fan. But I found that when I did write about it, it was some of the stuff that was most unique to me, because it's sort of, we're all kind of have comparable influences from our generation and kind of, the institution of who the great writers are. But I was the only one who was writing a story about, imagining that someone was told they were Hulk Hogan's little brother from childhood and kind of growing up under that guise, or stories about, people actually who were wrestlers. And so, during my MFA program, especially, I worked with Nick Dybeck, whose more famous father, Stuart Dybeck, is such a big deal in kind of classic literature. But for his workshop, I turned in a story about these teenage wrestling fans who are, kind of a similar generation, and found out that, he watched wrestling back in that period and sort of, knew the references, and that sort of gave me a license. Okay, I can write about this stuff, I can talk about it. And then by the end of the program, my last submission to my graduate workshop was 10 of the pieces from The Long Way Home, just the little flash pieces that, were each, like 500 words each. And so, pretty easy to digest, and kind of just seeing, which things immediately resonate and kind of translate to an audience that doesn't know or care or like this sort of stuff. And which pieces just, don't quite translate or don't really make sense kind of organically to a more casual audience, and just kind of took it from there. And so I always say, okay, now I'm done writing about wrestling. The Long Way Home includes pretty much every piece of fiction I've written about wrestling. There's like 1 or 2 stories that aren't in there. But then I just kind of wrote another book-length manuscript about wrestling stories. So there's at least one more in the pipe coming along.
No, I think wrestling in itself is narrative. It's storylines, and the most powerful ones, rivalries, right? Someone making the turn from hero to heel. I'm curious, and I want to read this one. I like, you got me from the beginning with how it starts, because not only did you capture a young male or female falling in love with wrestling from watching TV, you captured that childhood obsession that we all have. And I actually want to read just a couple lines from it. Do you mind?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So this is how it starts. It starts when I'm changing channels past my bedtime, but I'm home alone, so who can tell? It starts when I see the Lightning Kid do a black flip off the top rope, and his body collides upside down, chest to chest, with that of a much bigger Razor Raymond, and as a man in a powder blue shirt and bow tie slam his hand against the mat 3 times. It starts when I fetch the extra sheets from my closet, roll them tight, and affix them to the walls, to the headboard around my bed. Makeshift ropes, my bed transformed into a wrestling ring, my oversized teddy bear buddy playing the role of Bam Bam Bigelow, playing the role of Yakuza, playing the victim to my snap suplexes, Russian leg sweeps, and elbow drops. That is, Tunisha, I think you can weigh in. Does that not bring to life, if anyone wants to know, because maybe also we're all kind of children at heart, kind of that idea that you're getting to live through this person?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I can, even from just reading that or listening to you read that, it's like I can remember the first time I went to a wrestling event. And I remember it was at the Orange Pavilion in San Bernardino out here. It was like 1995, something like that. And then I remember it was, security wasn't as tight as things are right now. So I remember, you buy seats, but I ran all over that entire arena, and and it was fine. Like my mom just probably sat in the seat like, my kid is whacked, but I would run up to the barricade and you get slap hands. And then as soon as the match starts, then you go back to your seat a little bit. But I just ran all over that squared circle to like try and get every point of view. I remember there was just so much interaction, and that's what I loved about it. And that's what I still love about pro wrestling, because you get this real-time reaction. And even if you're at home, you can still feel the energy from the crowd that's there. I'm sure today we'll talk about how that's changed, given no audiences a little bit, and how, different promotions are doing different strategies to, produce their shows. But it's just electric, and there's something about it. And I've loved that. And it's even now from the time that's why I wanted to start getting into radio and film and screenwriting and stuff. It's because I've been watching pro wrestling since I was 5. It's like now I've been, very fortunate. It's like I've been, consulting and working with independent pro wrestling companies here in LA. And so seeing it now from a business perspective, it's just even more interesting, because I'm seeing the the intricate parts of everything and how much goes into putting on that show, because it is about the story, it's about the narrative, and these are larger than life, real life stuntmen. And it's fascinating that like people will still say like, you still watch wrestling? You know, and they have that kind of face about it. I'm like, yeah, you're wearing a Spider-Man shirt, fuck off. Like, I don't understand like why there's still why people still lead with, you know, it's fake, right? Like that's a deal breaker for me. Like there's nothing.
That's what my mom still says.
Yeah. Like, I don't know what other, you know, part of the conversation needs to happen if that is a statement you have to say in 2020. My immediate response is no shit. So is every blockbuster movie that you go and see and you pay $20 a week to go see. And guess who they're actually hiring to do the stunts? Probably wrestlers and other people. So they're the real men and women that are doing this in real time in front of you and having to improv. It is stage. It's the biggest spectacle, and to have seen it go through all the iterations that it has makes it even more fascinating as an adult and professor now, because I can see a lot of the overlap and integration of when something happens in society. It would be dumb of a sports organization to ignore it. You cannot. You have to address it, especially now. Digital media, social media, we're going to be talking about it. It would harm you more to ignore it than it would if you at least made a comment or statement about it. But that's why I'm fascinated, and I can't wait to read, you know, your work, Mike, because I think the words of painting pro wrestling like that as a spectacle, and that you get that childlike glee again, and that like, oh man, like I remember, you know, dropping elbows on my brother when he was asleep and then just leaving the room because I could. And I just thought it was hilarious, you know, and like Macho Man was my favorite. There was just so many overlaps, like Yankees, Red Sox, to those type of rivalries. Like that was Hulk Hogan, Macho Man in my house. Like you couldn't be a fan of one or both. You had to pick street, you know? So I just think, I just love it. And I think that, yeah, this is, it's great that there's so much overlap now, because there's at least recognition that professional wrestling has ancient lineages in history, like with globally, and the fact that it has influenced actual wrestling, catch wrestling, that being a thing, and that how that's crossed over into mixed martial arts. It's fascinating to me.
How do you navigate that tension? Because I'm really curious. You were bringing up how for so long you kept it a secret that you had this wrestling obsession, and Tunisha's talking about these moments, right? You bring it up to someone, and the first thing they say is like, "Oh, that's fake, right?" And they just kind of dismiss you and look down. So how did you navigate in literary circles as you started to bring forward these stories? Or did you ever have instances where you could tell people were judging you for the topic that you were writing about? Or was that just completely something you were more concerned about than actually than in reality was happening?
Yeah, I think that it was more of a concern than a reality. But I do still remember in my MFA program, the first time I brought in a wrestling story where I talk about the Road Warriors doing the Doomsday device, which was their signature finishing move. And one of the women in the workshop with me saying, I was so lost. I thought this was a apocalyptic story about kind of this dystopian society where they used a doomsday device to murder people. It took me pages to figure out what you were talking about, and she was clearly not on board with the story. So there have been moments like that. But that's not the worst beating I've taken in a workshop over a story, and so I think that some of it is just sort of that sticking with it. I had a good friend who was writing stories about trashy reality television sort of stuff, the Real Housewives sort of thing. Which isn't my thing at all, but she was writing really good stuff. And I think if it's a good story, then it sort of transcends that sort of stuff. And if you're not willing to let it transcend, if you're going to kind of have biases that kind of preclude you from liking something just because of the subject matter, then it's sort of, well, I'm never going to win you over. So you're not really the target audience for this, anyway, in that case. So but yeah, I think it's largely a thing of I suspect that almost all of us have some sort of nerdy taboo thing that we're into, if not multiple ones, and so just sort of that level of empathy of like, okay, that's your nerdy thing, so in this space I'm gonna accept that that's what this is about.
I think it's much more acceptable now too, like having those nerdy or just being a fan of something and having subcultures and sub communities that you feel affiliated with. It's totally fine. I mean, because I don't know. I keep hearing the phrase of like, you know, wrestling is pop culture, and it is. Like that's exactly it. Wrestling is pop culture, so it's like studying that as from multiple lenses of like whether you want to do it intellectually or socially, politically, or just even from a fan perspective, valid because it is pop culture. That's what it is. So it's what is it offering to the human experience that is making people so fascinated with it? Why do we feel like we always need to, you know, tabloids and things like that? And I think having those extra, I think it's more people are willing to say that they're a fan of wrestling now than they would have ever before. I mean, we're seeing guys like Enes Kanter, you know, a center for the Celtics, saying that, oh, you know, in the NBA, it's like, oh, dude, I'm going to wrestle. It's like the entire locker room, you know, I think of the Milwaukee Bucks, you know, with Giannis Antetokounmpo and like, and the
Like the Lopez brothers too.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like always just staging fights with, you know, in the locker room to hype themselves up to go to a basket, you know, to play basketball at the professional level. We obviously, you know, I'm sure we'll get into like the crossover and why they want to do that. We know financially, fiscally, economically, that is a reason why, because there is ridiculous amount of money constantly being pumped into the WWE, which has been, I think, you know, how traditional sports media will consider ESPN the mothership. That's the pro wrestling sports entertainment equivalent of the mothership. You don't make it until it's on there, right? But there are, of course, other means and ways to be successful in sports entertainment without having to go to that mothership. And now, you know, people are on purpose trying to go around that to either prove it to themselves and others, or two, because they don't like what that mothership stands for and what they've put up with, which is why there's, you know, things like Dark Side of the Ring now.
What is Dark Side of the Ring that's been brought up a few times? What does that mean?
Because it's on Vice. It's this
on Vice.
episode.
Oh, okay.
I've watched the Owen Hart because I think it was his anniversary of maybe his death that happened in 1999, which I remember. So
live, it was scary.
Yeah, we talked about this, but yeah, they're coming to, you know, definitely we're curating and we're realizing that there's more to it. Like I think Dark Side of the Moon is showing that there's more going on that we need to see. So I want to get into that kind of aspect, Tunisha. Can I ask though, because we've had some other writers who've become fighters, whether it's just for an amateur match or they've done it as just kind of just to see what it's like. And what I've found interesting is that they're able to show an intimacy that we don't get from watching it on the screen, where it is just this character. But what I love is that you're also in these stories, it's first person of the wrestler. And, you know, actually articulating what that feels like. And, you know, I would love to tell everyone to read it, because that is something also I want to see more of. So Mike, was that a decision, a deliberate, that you wanted to kind of show a new space of these wrestlers?
Yeah, you know, and it's something to be transparent. I have never wrestled myself, neither in a professional nor amateur setting or anything along those lines.
I've never boxed or done MMA. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, I think it's one of those things where you know, we talk in fiction workshops a lot about whether something is fully imagined, whether you can actually sort of, you know, see all the details of kind of, you know, how it would work. And I think wrestling is enough of an obsession of mine for long enough that I've read so many of the memoirs and I've listened to many of the podcasts and watched the documentaries that I feel like I do have a sense of what it would be like, to the extent someone can have without having actually done it. And so with that, yeah, it sort of what was sort of the challenge to put myself in that position and to kind of write from that perspective. And I think, you know, one of the advantages I have is, you know, most of us haven't been a professional wrestler. And so there is a fair degree of latitude that if I can get like 60% of the way there, I'm probably, you know, crossed way over a line that most folks will be able to call me on. And so just kind of using my imagination from there.
Yeah. Well, can I also use your imagination or your literary background? We've all brought this up. It's not real. It's a storyline, narrative. Can you explain why it's so captivating, even though how we are able to have this dissonance?
Yeah. I think that's a great question that we could probably do a whole podcast on. Tunisha might have more insight on kind of why this works from a psychological kind of perspective. But I'll say that I think, on the most base level, I think back to, the roots of my fanhood are in my grandfather was a Chinese immigrant who never learned how to speak English at any, real functional level. And when he came over, wrestling was one of the few forms of entertainment that he could wrap his head around, because it was like, okay, everyone's cheering, that's a good guy. Everyone's booing, that's a bad guy. They're fighting, I get that. And so just kind of, watching from there. And while I like to think that my fanhood is on a lot more kind of sophisticated level at this point, that's still kind of the core of it, right? Is that, I like this person, I don't like this person. I want that person to win the fight. And the fact that it's all, predetermined, I think does set it up such that we can have satisfying resolutions on a consistent basis. In MMA, I'm no expert in MMA. I don't have very strong allegiances, but by the same token, I'll say, Conor McGregor, I know, kind of positions himself as sort of a villain in a lot of cases, and he won't ever necessarily get his comeuppance because he's really good, right? And so, in wrestling, of course he would get his comeuppance eventually. He would be the heel, and come his third or fourth WrestleMania, somebody would beat him and put him in his place in humiliating fashion. But in MMA, that may or may not ever happen. So I think there is something satisfying just of if it's being done well from performance and from a storytelling kind of perspective, that we have stories we invest in, and then we ultimately will have some degree of a satisfying conclusion coming out of that.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I would say we've been telling stories since before the wheel, right? We've been writing stories with dirt on walls and rocks, and we've been transcribing things, and we love story. It is how we make sense of the world. It's how we make sense of each other and everything about it. Wrestling is a language, and it's just a way that you can see a story played in front of you, no words, but with body and and athleticism. And you can see who the bad guy is and who the good guy is while it's being played out. You don't need a color commentator in your ear telling you. If you're there live, you can see it literally in front of you. And you see it's that complete narrative arc where you have the rise and the conflict, and you have all of that in its physical form. And I love that. And as a kid, I just liked the Ultimate Warrior because he was fast as hell and he wore streamers on his arm. And I was like, my bike has streamers. And then his face paint, and just, he was huge, and he ran, he sprints. And I was, so when you're a kid, that's like an initial touch point for you, right? And you're like, I F with that guy. I like him, And so, but then you'll just get introduced to other parts of it. And so, like, as I got older, there was the Attitude Era. DX, Steve Austin, The Rock. And I was like, I'm a teenager now. This is a complete rebellious era of wrestling. I'm completely rebellious. Oh my God. As being, 14, 15-year-old girl in high school, every day I think I wore a wrestling related t-shirt. So it's like, as I've grown up, I've seen wrestling grow up. And I think a lot of people have gone through the same thing. So why it's still so captivating, even though we know it's predetermined, we all do. We all watch movies and Game of Thrones and everything else on TV that's appointment television, knowing that it's predetermined. Wrestling, to me, of course, it's predetermined, but it's literally played out in real time in front of me. And that's something that I can just respect the hell out of. And Chris Jericho, who I think arguably would be on the Mount Rushmore of wrestling, if we were going to do that, he could have a great claim in that. He was quoted once of saying that if William Shakespeare was alive today, he'd be writing wrestling. And I absolutely agree. It's completely logical to think that because of the story and just how much everything is a reflection of society and just the most shocking things at the same time, I think it's completely true. And I love that he said that, because I think he just not only gets it, but I think it's quite true, because it paints to how story is the center of everything when it comes to the human experience and sports role in it. And clearly every other sport is getting that now. That's why we're getting, while they're coming out in some weird knockoff Legion of Doom outfit. You know what I mean? That's why we having Henry Cejudo playing, you know, this Burger King thing, and why Conor McGregor, per your point, is all coming out now like a McMahon with his strut and stuff. And it's like, we get it. And so does the rest of the world, which is why they're now trying to hop on in some way, shape, or form.
What appeals to you about writing within that space? Because you're not writing the storylines of wrestling, but there's something about that, like, what is writing characters that are involved with wrestling allow you to get at? Or are there certain things, what about that space interests you? Because you're doing all the things that are kind of, we don't see if we just watch wrestling. You're writing all around that thing that we all know. So I'm just curious what it gives you access to, or what, because you keep getting drawn back to it over and over.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's some of that, you know, in Hamlet, to go to Shakespeare, since Tunisha brought it up, you know, there's the play within a play, right? And I think that wrestling really invites that kind of dialogue between, this is about the fictional story that's being told here, and sort of what that does, because, you know, I think that there is also a really interesting interplay between your reality and fiction in wrestling, because, you know, there is a degree of physicality and people, you know, actually, you know, absorbing physical punishment. But there are also, you know, a lot of people who, there's some really blurry lines around. Like my all-time favorite, kind of most respected wrestler is Bret Hart. And the main criticism he tends to get a lot is that he takes himself way too seriously, because sincerely thought that he was the best at these things, and sincerely, you know, had a lot of resentment towards people who were not as, you know, careful about their craft, or who injured people. And some of this is very legitimate, and some of this is, okay, dude, you're an actor. Like, you're an athletic actor kind of playing a part that's been assigned to you, and had the privilege of being, you know, assigned to the role of champion a few times. But yeah, so I think the kind of, you know, playing with that, though, of, you know, it's like any, you know, art or kind of competitive form, I think, where you know, is let's see, is Taylor Swift, you know, the best vocalist of our generation? Probably not. I mean, I don't know enough about, you know, music to really say objectively, but I don't think so. But is she making the most money? Is she the most famous, the most celebrated in that field? I mean, probably. She's on a very short list, at least for those things. And by a similar token, you can look at, you know, wrestling and say, you know, John Cena is not kind of the artist that a Bret Hart was, right? And he's not the talker that a CM Punk was, or any of these things. But nonetheless, just kind of the combination of, you know, being a really jacked up dude and being kid friendly and coming at the right time, all kind of worked in his favor, and he became the biggest star of his generation. And so some of this interplay between what that really means, you know, and I think there are some wrestlers who are very level-headed about, I'm just here for a paycheck, I'm doing whatever I'm told to do, and some who've taken it very seriously, and kind of all along that spectrum that I think is interesting ground to play with as a fan, and kind of speculating about it in fiction.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy, because there are role players, right? And that's,
Yeah.
and, you know, 15th guy on the bench, you know, in the NBA, it's like, we know that there are role players in this. And just like any other business, it's how the effort and work that you put in it, you know? And it's like, when the office recognizes that, and when fans demand, because wrestling is a social listening tool in and of itself. If you go there, we literally will write signs. I still have some signs that I had when I was a kid. Like, we will literally tell you how you think, what we think of what you just put out there, and how dare you don't ever bring that back. Like, we will literally do that, and fans still do today. And so when fans demand something, plus when people are getting a certain push, that gets recognized. And so there literally is, I mean, it's not just like, okay, you can win today. You know, like, this is a very, there's no algorithm to it, you know, like, it's a very organic way of how stars are created and who's getting pushed and who's not.
Okay, this is something, I'm glad you brought this up, Tunisha, because I am captivated with the other part of wrestling, the storytelling of these rivalries going on. Who are those writers? Is that a big secret? Is it a team that make decision? Is it Vince McMahon, who's just like, I want this to happen? Because I think they deliberately maybe keep this obtuse. Is that, Mike, do you know any thoughts on this?
I would say up until probably the last, maybe like 10 years or so, 15 years or so, I would say that that's absolutely true, that there's a pretty thick in there that we wouldn't, you know or see. I think that the start of peeling back that curtain in a very public way was probably the Attitude Era that Tunisha was referencing, where Steve Austin and Vince McMahon were kind of going to war, and Vince McMahon kind of became a caricature of himself on screen, where hardcore internet fans kind of know that he's sort of the head creative guy with WWE. And so now I'm going to play kind of the most over-the-top version of that, where I'm controlling people and I'm all megalomaniacal and all of that. I think that now it's relatively open. I mean, I couldn't name for you everybody who's on any given writing team or whatnot, but it's fairly out in the open that Vince McMahon is the creative head of WWE and kind of the be all end all, but that guys like Bruce Pritchard and really Triple H are kind of key members of his staff. And kind of contributing ideas. But one of the criticisms that I think WWE gets in that mold is for having sort of a corporate kind of micromanagey kind of approach to all that. And I'm speaking purely from an outsider's perspective. I've never worked for them, but there's All Elite Wrestling, which is kind of the closest thing to a competitor WWE has now. Where the general consensus seems to be that part of the appeal for working there is that people can kind of figure out their own characters a little bit more. When they're giving an interview, they get kind of general, like, go talk about why you don't like this person, and and throw in something about how you're going to injure their knee. Whereas in WWE, you'll get like 2 pages of bullet points. These are the points you need to hit. Memorize this before you go out to the ring and say it. And sort of that level of kind of determining everything and kind of writing it almost like it were a movie, as opposed to this is sort of the kind of movie with a lot of actors who can improv, right? Where we're going to give you the broad strokes and you can figure out the rest and kind of define yourself. So that'd be kind of my take there.
I also want to bring up, so I've had students write their final papers, which I have them research a fighter or a fight and look how it kind of encapsulates society. So I had one student take Hulk Hogan, and he did it through each of these eras, how like the Attitude Era was reflecting what was going on in America at the time. There was patriotism at some points. It's when he became, because his character shifted so many times, and he even did the one where he went to Saudi Arabia and what that showed about our geopolitics. It's a really good paper. I also had someone, and this is maybe talking about maybe the possible I mean, with everything we have positive and negatives. And someone did the Iron Sheik, and kind of took a look at what he did and what he was standing for, which maybe showed some anti-Arab and anti-Muslim, or I can't exactly remember all of the things that were going on, but what do you say about that, where people say, are there stereotypes being used?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big part of kind of wrestling history, largely in an unfortunate way. I mean, I think that there are times, Cold War era, evil Russians and evil Iranians and whatnot, like it fit the culture of the time, at least the audience that WWE was catering to. I think a lot of it is kind of unfortunate in retrospect. I think sort of the last gasp of that, I think, was there was a character, Muhammad Hassan, who I think is just super fascinating. He's actually he's from upstate New York. He's an Italian guy, but he played a Muslim American character. And I'll give the real Cliff Notes version of this, because I don't want to bore listeners with too much about wrestle talk. But basically, it started out a super nuanced character, where basically he was not so far removed from 9/11. And he was talking about how he was super discriminated against and felt as though Americans didn't treat him fairly. And he was a heel character, but the best heel characters often are one who you can understand his point of view, right? Like ultimately he's kind of coming up on a less constructive approach to the world, but nonetheless we get why he'd be angry. And it kind of degraded over time, and sort of I think some elements got rushed. But ultimately, it kind of came to a climax with him having a bunch of masked men who were sort of caricatures of terrorists coming to the ring and helping him choke out the Undertaker with piano wire. And yeah, it coincided with some London terrorist bombings, so it was kind of the worst possible timing. And I think that was sort of, there's been a lot of xenophobic stuff in wrestling, since then. So don't get me wrong, it wasn't the end of it, but I think it was the last time it was featured at that level, where we're going to go this intense with something that's this kind of current of an issue. And the network pushed back against it. Advertisers got upset about it. And the sad thing to me always is the performer behind it. I think his name is Mark Capitelli or Capani, or I always mispronounce his name. But regardless, this guy's career was basically over after that point. He was a relatively elite level performer in his 20s, I think, still at that point. And there was no coming back from that. It was just such a kind of, universally panned, kind of, oversimplified, kind of ugly take on kind of the dynamics there. And so, he wrestled one more match where he got totally destroyed, and then he was never on TV again after that.
It's bad writing, basically. Yeah. If you're going to do something nuanced, it shows you how that happens. Kyle, do you?
Yeah, well, I was just curious because I keep returning to how you operate within the space. And it's a little bit of a selfish question for me because as someone who researches MMA, one of the things I'm always curious about is how do people perceive me from the outside? A lot of the conferences I go to, the areas I write are gender studies, right? So am I that dude who just researches MMA, which is from the outside perceived as this very masculine space? And we could talk about how gender plays out in the actual space. But I'm curious, we're talking about issues of race and stereotypes. And again, you're writing in this space that from the outside is perceived as a rather conservative space, one that can exaggerate or sell stereotypes, is perceived as a very masculine space. So again, thinking back to what it means for you to be writing in there and how people perceive you, do you ever get the sense that, are you labeled as, oh, you're the wrestling dude who writes about these things? What does it mean to be writing stories in that type of space? Or I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I'm just trying to think through how you deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and something I do, no pun intended, grapple with over and over. But I think it is something where, like for example, in my teaching, I tend to have a wrestling day each semester where there's a great poet, Todd Kaneko, who writes a lot about wrestling as well. And we read some of his poems and one of his essays, but that's always very late in the semester. So it's sort of after that point when I've established my credibility and sort of, we know that's not all I'm going to talk to them about. But to your point though, in a broader literary sense, I think it's a combination of the two. I think it's something I'm conscious of not wanting to only write about wrestling and only publish about wrestling for fear of kind of being pigeonholed in that way. While kind of trying to strike that balance of like, on one hand, this could be seen as sort of a taboo. On the other hand, this is a niche that kind of gets me in the door in some places, right? I mean, I wouldn't be having this great conversation with all of you if it weren't for me writing about wrestling. And so kind of, finding the appropriate times and places to lean into it. But I think, when I talk about it, Nancy was referencing, the Short Way Home podcast. And I think it's representative of how when I start talking about wrestling, I tend to start using some relatively highfalutin vocabulary and, bigger story concepts because I want to demonstrate like, no, this can be academic, right? And I'm not a Neanderthal just because I'm operating in this space. And I always have mixed feelings. There's a degree to which that feels unnecessarily kind of apologist and like I need to compensate for something. But yeah, so unfortunately, I think I'm at the same issue as you, Kyle. I think I don't have a great answer, but yeah, I think all those considerations come into play.
Yeah, and that's so fascinating because it, in a sense, is doing you're playing into this idea that it's lesser than by feeling that you have to make an excuse or say it's not about wrestling, when in reality, writing about wrestling is the same as writing about music, which is the same about writing about reality television, which is the same as writing about opera, right? Sure. But with wrestling, you have to start using and enhancing your vocabulary more than if you were writing a poem about or a short story about opera.
I honestly feel like I even had to do that about sports, period, at least within, a legitimate accredited psychology program, right? Like where there is a division of sports psychology, like within the APA, but looking sometimes when I entered, I remember my PhD program was like 2013 and they're like, what are you interested in? And I was like, I want to look at sports. And they're like, like you get that like sad, happy dog tilt, like, okay. But over the course of time, it's like showing that, look, this is an embedded part of human fabric. Like this is legitimate. We need to study this. And especially looking at how we make meaning, sports' role in economic, political, social, cultural segments of the human experience, clutch, it's art. And so when you break it down even further to these niches, like pro wrestling, combat sports, gymnastics, anything, then you can see that, yeah, that there's specialties in here, and each one will kind of have its own color when you try and paint a broader picture of what society looks like. Like each one adds something different and is worth the investigation of.
No, and I actually think if you can bridge highbrow literary terms with pile driver and elbow, what are the elbow drops? That is what you want, you know, to have those worlds collide. Because I think a lot of academics actually, they feel that they don't know that jargon maybe, and feel removed.
Sure.
And but when you bridge those two, that's where I find you're really going to explore interesting spaces and really understand social movements and you know, why we appreciate this, why it drives us. You know, you talk about like the storytelling, there's a satisfaction. And I think that we can't disregard it because it may not look like the opera or the symphony. So.
No, I totally agree. Because yeah, I like that analogy too of like the highbrow kind of stuff, because it is a way at least to just look at different forms of art, and that there is an intellectual lens that you could use to look at it and speak about it in a highly academic and formidable way. You know, like there's pertinent information that you can pull from all of these different segments, because there are different demographics that appeal to certain things. You know, it's like genres of music. Some speaks to me, some don't. You know, and sports, entertainment, combat sports, same way. And you can see how some matches will be, you know, you can see it's jazz because they're just improvising and they're writing it in the ring in front of them, you know, and all they know is who's supposed to win. And it's like, you guys can figure it out on your own. We got 10 minutes, go. And I've seen that. And then you can see the more technical, you know, Bret Hart style technicians, where you can see at Lucha Libre, amazing, you know, because you could literally see just like the massive forms of athleticism and in terms of high risk moves and stuff that's going on in real time in front of you. So it's fascinating. And so I always love in opportunities to like try and integrate pro wrestling and sports entertainment period into other verticals. The PCA has been great, the Pop Culture Association, because they have divisions on pro wrestling. There was a pro wrestling symposium that happened the week of WrestleMania last month in April that I spoke on, which was fantastic. And there's another one on sports culture period, because I think now, like we said earlier, now in 2020, it's at least a bit more, all right, like there's less resistance on accepting that sports and pro wrestling / sports entertainment, whatever you want to call it, has earned its seat at the table and having a legitimate conversation.
Yeah. Well, I really want to also, this is so great. I want to transition this to talking about how wrestling really was the only sport that didn't really adapted the best to the pandemic. I mean, I think that, you know, and you got to give that credit, I guess, to Vince McMahon and what he was able to do in Florida. But they were
able. Had something to do with it, I think, too.
Yeah.
Promoter, you got, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, that's saying a lot, considering that all major, like music events, you know, film, all of these things got shut down. You know, we've seen some sports coming back. I'm curious what you think about how it transitioned, because I've heard, you know, without the fans is affecting the sport or the performance more than others, like UFC and other things.
Yeah, I mean, to me, a big part of what makes someone a successful professional wrestler is provoking a reaction from the fans. You know, because there's all sorts of things about, you know, technical precision and, you know, about kind of, you know, ability to speak and things along those lines that, you know, now we do have, you know, kind of live feedback, because everyone's on Twitter when a show's happening. And so we'll know if people like something or not. And I think that's a part of how it can still function. But I will say, I've actually been sort of disappointed with kind of how it's played out by and large, because I sort of feel as though, specifically with WWE's product, that for the most part, they've just kind of kept doing what they're doing. It's just there's no fans there. And a few of the performers I think translated really well, where, you know, for example, Seth Rollins is one of the top stars now, and is kind of a cardio freak. And the guy has demonstrated that he is completely able to keep trash talking and verbalizing all throughout the match in a way that sort of adds a dimension of feeling like a fight, and like there's an added level of drama and dialogue going on. Whereas for a lot of the performers, it's just sort of now we can just hear them grunting more, you know, and it's sort of just, you know, I think the best of what's been done, in my opinion, and this is pretty controversial at this point, I think that history will look back at this and sort of have its own opinions, but has been the more cinematic kind of presentation of some of it. WrestleMania, for example, that you know, was kind of the I don't know, the turning point in a way, because that's kind of the big event where they were going to have 70,000 people in a stadium. They ended up, you know, still having it, only having it in front of, you know, an empty arena. But they had two matches where they did just kind of totally dropped the artifice of conventional professional wrestling. One was a boneyard match, which was filmed at a cemetery and at this old farmhouse, and just sort of staged like a movie fight. And that one I felt it was good. I felt like that was better than it would have been in the ring. I felt like that was a step in the right direction. And then there was the all the more controversial, they called it a Firefly Funhouse match, where there's a character, Bray Wyatt, who is sort of consistently playing with people psychologically and playing pranks on them in sort of, you know, kind of dark ways. And he wears a horror movie mask to the ring half the time and all of these things. So he sort of hosted John Cena in his Firefly Funhouse, where they did this kind of, it was sort of this art house movie, essentially, where Cena went through old versions of himself, and then old versions of wrestlers were kind of analogous to him. He was sort of playing Hulk Hogan a couple times throughout the film or the match, whatever you call it. And I thought it was brilliant. There are a lot of people who hated it and think, you know, how can you watch this and then take stuff in the ring seriously? They can't exist in the same, you know, on the same plane. And I think that's where, if you're trying to, you know, kind of pass off wrestling is completely on the up and up and it's legitimate sport, it is problematic in that sense. But if you're accepting that this is all sort of a form of fiction that we've all kind of accepted, you know, certain rules about, it was a really fun just kind of experimentation with those rules and seeing, you know, what we can do with that. You know, and I talked about this on the last episode of the Short Way Home podcast, but I think matches like that, kind of almost counterintuitively, if you're going to show to a non-fan, I think that's the kind of stuff you could show them that they might actually respond to more than a traditional wrestling match, because it's visually interesting. There are special effects and there are costume changes, and you know, all this stuff where you couldn't pull it off in front of a live audience. And so, you know, it doesn't appeal to traditionalists that there's no way you can really call a match like that sport. It's you know, they don't make any bones about the fact that it's all pre-taped and all kind of, you know, with all sorts of artistic cuts and whatnot. But I think matches like that demonstrate what we can do in the current format without a live audience. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff that they should lean into more for however long we're in the current environment.
I thought it was interesting too, because I remember watching WrestleMania, and this was the first time that they split it across 2 days. It was Saturday and Sunday, when it's normally, you know, when I was a kid, it was a 3-hour event on Sunday, and then it became 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7, 8 damn hours. So they split it into 2 days, which just shows, I don't know, a lot of different things. But in regards to those matches, I did love it. I loved the Boneyard match, and I think they obviously have the narrative freedom to do that, right? Create predetermined and pre-produced, pre-filmed, you know, matches like that, like given the pandemic and stuff. So that's even why they were able to, you know, keep, you know, WrestleMania and the weekly wrestling shows going on right now, because some of it is not being done live, right? So they have that narrative freedom to do so, as opposed to like an MMA event. Like those are the first live events that are back, right? But in terms of like the appeal and having to go through the no fan era that we're in right now, I think AEW has been doing the best job about it on a week-to-week basis. And I think too, WWE, per your point, I think is just still doing the same thing. There's just no fans. But with AEW, I think they've at least bought in, and they're they've got the rest of the roster on different sides of the ring, right? So you have the heels over there and you got the faces over there. And so they're reacting as if they're fans. They're watching the other bad guys. They're watching the matches in front of them and they're cheering for, you know, whatever face or heel team like side that they're on a little bit. So they've got this real, and even those wrestlers, the talent that's surrounding the ring, you know, sitting, standing on the opposite side of the barricades, they're reacting like we would. They'd be like, oh, you know, and Britt Baker's out there with her phone and she's doing what fans would do. And so it's creating even extra content after the fact that fans can see after, you know, watch it on social. It's hilarious to me. So from a product standpoint, I've been watching more AEW because I think they've integrated I forgot for a few times, you know, that there's no fans there. With WWE, if I flip over to Raw or NXT, I'm just like, oh yeah, and I just go away. But that's the thing. Like you can go through waves of fandom and seeing what they're doing with the product that they're putting out. If it's not vibing with you, there's probably always another option, which has been like the last 20 years of my life being a wrestling fan. So
was a lot of the negative reaction to the two WWE matches that you're both talking about, is that a result of it not it's accepting that they're letting go of the illusion that everyone knows is the illusion? Is that's the problem in the backlash? Because when it gets more produced, it acknowledges what everyone knows but isn't supposed to acknowledge. Is that what's going on? Or I'm just curious, like what the
Yeah, I think there are kind of two levels to it. I think one is sort of it's no longer just wrestling. So when we watch sort of a wrestling show that's in a ring, it's like, okay, we all know what we're watching. We all have kind of accepted the world and the physics of this world and so on and so forth. As soon as you take a step away from that, I think you're asking someone to accept a totally different set of rules. And so, you know, if Bray Wyatt can force John Cena to forget his old identity and become a new identity and so on and so forth, that's a whole nother stretch there, right? Whereas who enjoys sort of, you know, speculative sort of science fiction, fantasy sort of stuff, I'm there for it. I'm on board. But as someone who you know, is really invested in sort of the realism to the extent that pro wrestling recognizes it, I think they can't necessarily, you know, be on board with that. So there's that, and then there are the Jim Cornettes, I'll say, of the who Cornette is sort of as traditionalist as traditionalist gets, which includes being kind of racist and kind of sexist sometimes. But beyond that, he's very invested in sort of protecting the business, where basically if you're not in it, that, you know, it should all be passable as real to you. Sort of, you know, that old school where people like him and like Bill Watts, who's from a similar generation, would say, you know, if someone calls out a wrestler for a fight in real life, you should take the fight and you should win, or else you no longer have a place in this company, because you've kind of broken the illusion that these are these elite athletes and fighters and whatnot. Which isn't, I think, the contemporary mindset that very many people have. But when you start putting that sort of thing in front of them, where it's all this sort of, you know, movie stuff, where, you know, at the end of the Boneyard match, the Undertaker gets on a motorcycle and raises his fist and flames shoot out of this farmhouse. And it's sort of like, that's so pro wrestling. That is completely, if that were in a stadium, we would all be like, yeah, that's fine. That's what he does. But if we're saying this is a random, you know, farmhouse, we're supposed to accept this as a real fight, that makes no sense whatsoever. Right. And so it's the question of whether you're kind of on board for that ride or not at that point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The Undertaker has come back from the dead multiple times,
okay.
Right? Okay, so we accept that, but once you leave the stadium, then you can no longer accept it.
Right. I saw him get buried alive, and then his purple glove came out. I believe it was called Buried Alive, was the name of the pay-per-view in your house. I remember that. Yeah. I think too, the one thing that I hope, because I loved that Boneyard match so much, just what I hope happens is that they don't overdo it, which is what pisses me off about wrestling sometimes, is that we can be introduced to something great and then they just keep shoving it down our throats and then it lost its appeal. Like, not everything needs to be billed as a Super Bowl, right? Like, not everything needs to be a spectacle. Like, it loses its specialty and its, you know, freshness if now we're going to keep getting those style of matches. And it's not new. Like, Lucha Underground has been doing this since 2014, 13, you know? And so it's just now that WWE, you know, is that like mothership, just synonymous with pro wrestling by default to, you know, a layman or someone who doesn't know the industry that well. Then you would assume that this is the first style of wrestling being presented in this way. And it's not. So I just hope that it doesn't get over drawn, and we don't get these like every week now, or on every pay-per-view we're going to have like a fiery Funhouse or a Boneyard, or some odd Randy Orton Edge like no holds barred match in the back. It's like, I just hope it doesn't get oversaturated to that, because I think balance is super important, and sometimes different wrestling promotions can overdo it.
Yeah. Oh, we probably don't have enough time to really go into it, but I think Kyle brought up gender, because women have been a part of the wrestling. I mean, when was the first woman who like made a scene in the pro wrestling world, like at WWF? WWE.
I mean, I go to Fabulous Moolah, although she was by no means the first. I know that she in terms of literal WWF, because it was Capital Wrestling Association, then it was Worldwide Wrestling Federation, then it was the World Wrestling Federation when Vince McMahon Jr. Vincent Kennedy McMahon took over, and she was the first kind of champion that he had, and passed it to Wendy Richter, and kind of on from that. But she's a super problematic figure. But yeah, to answer your original question, I think that when we look at least a contemporary wrestling lens, we sort of look to her as kind of the one of the earliest figures.
And what era was this?
So this would have been, I mean, this was in the 1980s, but she had already been doing it for quite some time leading up to that.
No, because we look at combat sports, and where, women boxing has always kind of been up and down. We had like Christy Martin, Layla Ali, now we have Clarissa Shields, but it's never been this consistent. Same with MMA, thankfully, I think women, it's a young sport. So when they made the transition, and UFC was in 2013, and they've been a pretty regular part of it. But women, I mean, they had their first all women's, was it a wrestle? It wasn't WrestleMania.
No, it was another pay-per-view that they had. It was called the Women's Revolution, and there was an entire card of female matches. And there's been a long history and a few series that have been putting out about the history of women in professional wrestling, period. Corey Erdman wrote a great piece about it, about Black women wrestling, even going farther back in the 50s, and some of the trials and tribulations that they've had in that, of like having to go through the South, because back in the day there were territories, regions of wrestling, as opposed to, TV distribution and all this stuff. So in going through the South, there's many stories that have been documented where Black women wrestlers had to travel in the trunk because they didn't want the fans to see them going in there for their own health, for their own safety. Right. And then when they come out as performers, everything's fine and stuff. But leaving the arena, they often had to hide because, the whole racism thing. But, there's a lot of controversy and stuff, too, like with the Mae Young Classic and stuff, and like wanting to rename certain things because things have come out about her being racist and discriminatory in the locker room and stuff. But there's, like everything, there's evolution, and there's a back and forth in terms of like growth. So, because I remember as a kid, like Medusa was the first when I was a kid, like women's wrestler that I remember. And then as champion. And then there was Sapphire next to, Dusty Rhodes, who was my absolute favorite. I loved her as a kid, and Dusty Rhodes too. Just seeing them dance and stuff, it was fantastic. And then in the 90s, it became more of a divas title. They literally renamed it. So it's not like you're a women's wrestler, you're a divas champion. And that was more of like the bra and panties matches, the mud wrestling matches. It wasn't, necessarily athleticism. You were there for your looks. And then they say that there was a lot of resistance fans, and obviously like social listening and stuff. It's like, no, man, like we can roll too. Like women can be like, we're more than just bra and panties matches. And so then it, changed again, and they, created more of a women's division, and with different, it motivated them to create, the all women's card and stuff. And they haven't done one since. They've been saying like, okay, well, we're going to do this. But, also last year's WrestleMania 35, that was the first time they headlined a WrestleMania, and that was the Ronda Rousey, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair. So these are all names, all legitimate, and they were, the first to headline it. So there's been great movement and great progress for that, but it's still not perfect. It's still not perfect, I think. Getting into, you could get into more details, and that should be its own subject for one of these, I think. But for a lot of different levels in terms of like race and women as well, with how this stuff is being put out. But yeah, it's definitely grown. It's definitely grown. And so I know we've talked too about more MMA, like, okay, well, will there be an all MMA female or an all female MMA card? And that I feel like would be much more forced, and not as opposed to in WWE, like that was forced too. Like it was like, all right, look, we have all these women's talent, and the fans were asking for it a little bit. And they have, again, the narrative freedom to do so and the money, but I don't know, I could go back and forth on it.
Yeah, no, Mike or.
Yeah, well, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, Tanisha's brought this up, a few times, and I think it's a very, I think, legitimate point of just kind of the degree to which pro wrestling can be a commentary on kind of what's going on in the broader culture, and and I think it's very telling that I think in the 90s, Sable, I think, is probably the most important figure in mainstream women's wrestling. She wasn't a good wrestler at all. She was a very attractive woman, and so that they leaned full tilt into kind of the sexual elements of that character. I don't know that she was the only reason they brought back the women's championship, but it had been kind of defunct, kind of dormant for a couple years. And then she kind of got explosively popular and, was athletic enough to be, functional in the ring. But I think that the connections between kind of selling sex and selling wrestling, for women's wrestling, I think have been such a big factor there. And, there was a long-term relationship where WWE would have women's wrestlers pose for Playboy each year, and they would often theme a WrestleMania match kind of related to that. And I think to Tanisha's point, I mean it's been taken a lot more seriously. I would say this is just in the last certainly in the last decade, maybe even more recently, maybe the last 5 years or so, that we see the Becky Lynches and the Charlotte Flairs and Sasha Bankses and so on and so forth, who kind of come forward and are more legitimately, we can watch one of their matches and like it's not as though we're grading on a curve anymore. Like we're not saying like, okay, so she's a fitness model who they're putting on display for us here, so we know she's not going to be very good in the ring. We'll grade it on those terms. Now I think that they're every bit as kind of talented and kind of taken seriously as their male counterparts. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens from here, and especially most recently, Becky Lynch, who I think I would say was the top female star for WWE, announced her pregnancy. So she is out of action for at least the next year, and who knows? I mean, parenthood is a thing that shakes our whole world, and I hope she'll be back. I think it's very possible she'll be back, but it's also possible she won't. And it's the first time a WrestleMania main event winner, within a year and a half's time, has gone out of action because she was pregnant. That's just never happened before, and how WWE will respond, I think, it remains to be seen.
Yes. Oh, this is fascinating. This is news to me. Becky Lynch. Wow. The main, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And Kyle, you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I had a question related to that, and I think it kind of brings together a few of the topics we've been discussing, which is, it seems like during the pandemic and the way sports have responded, it's raised lots of ethical questions for fans. And in the same way that if you're watching a product where we could celebrate some aspects related to the treatment of women, but we could also be very critical of some of the ways both the WWE, other professional wrestling organizations, the UFC has used women, as sold them as a certain sexualized product. But as a fan, how do you navigate some of the ethical challenges of watching a production like this? Thinking about how the WWE took no time off when we knew about the coronavirus and just kind of went straight ahead. We've thought a lot about what it means for the UFC to be holding these events. Are there points where you've said, what am I doing? And then how do you continue forward after that?
Go first.
Yeah, either of you on that.
You're the guest.
Okay. I'll say, yeah, it's tricky. I mean, because I'll say at heart, I don't agree with a lot of WWE's business practices. I think in my ideal version of this, there would be a union, and they wouldn't be independent contractors. They'd be, salaried employees, and everything that comes with that. So there's a lot of moral issues connected to everything that this company does. In terms of the coronavirus, pandemic kind of crisis, I'm sort of the mind that I agreed with WrestleMania going on, in part just because I knew, personally as a fan, personally for my own, I'm overstating it, but to a point for my mental health, still having that, what was a good thing, right? Because that was sort of just a few weeks after we started kind of wide scale quarantine and all of that. I think that after that point, it feels less responsible to me, just from a public health kind of perspective, to keep doing these things. And that's not exclusive to WWE. AEW, the Tunisha was referencing earlier, has also continued having cards where even if it is only 30, 40 people, essential personnel, that's still a crowd of people that you're bringing together that's not entirely responsible in this day and age. So particularly with WWE, something that sort of interests me is that their partnership with ESPN, they've been airing old WrestleManias on there. And I haven't tracked the numbers very carefully, but I think that they're doing somewhat comparable numbers to what they do for a regular Monday Night Raw or SmackDown kind of broadcast. And one thing that makes me wonder is that they have such an incredibly vast tape library. They could still put out television on a weekly basis that I as someone who I consider myself probably among the top like 10% in terms of having consumed wrestling media. Still the WWE Network library, I doubt that I've seen more than like 30% of it, because there's just so much stuff on there, right? And so if we just repackage, any of those, thousands and thousands of hours, I think they could put out something that in some ways would be probably more entertaining than wrestling from an empty arena. I'm more okay with the occasional special, like kind of the culture is to do a monthly pay-per-view event, or now it's, I don't know, a lot of it's just on WWE Network at this point. That would be the compromise I think I'd be comfortable with, is like, monthly-ish or every other month, something along those lines. In the in-between time, but both from a public health perspective, I feel it's irresponsible, and from just from a presentation perspective, I feel like it is less entertaining. I'll be honest, I've watched a few highlights on YouTube, the 5-minute clips of kind of the best of stuff. I haven't watched a full episode of Raw since all of this started. And to be fair, I didn't watch it on a weekly basis necessarily anyway. I kind of would read reviews and watch highlights and all that. But I've watched very few of those highlights, relatively speaking, since that time. And I feel like if they were to just kind of take a break, like just take this few month period, come back strong for SummerSlam in August, I feel like that would actually be a pretty constructive approach to this. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
No, no, and I appreciate, and I want to. Oh, but by the way, are the Bella twins? Those are WWE. They're both pregnant at the same time, right?
I think that's so. They've been away from WWE for a little bit. I don't follow. They have their reality TV series.
It's a baby boom. And then, I've heard of them through, I think, other parts of entertainment, how they connect together.
They had MMA connections too, because Henry Cejudo had a connection with them for a while.
Oh, really?
After he won, it was a big deal that he got to go out and have drinks with them or something.
I love it. Yeah, see, we're all starstruck by wrestlers. Come on. No, and I know we're getting kind of like past, we're over an hour, which I love. And I was thinking, I want to go into like Roland Barthes, his mythologies, how he used wrestling at that sense. So we're going to have to table that. You're going to have to come back, Mike, as we talk about this. Can I ask for some projections? And I'm going to ask one because I've had 2 people text me. Do you think that Rhonda is this whole thing where she came out against the fans of WWE, I think calling them disrespectful or other things? Is that into her? Is that Rhonda, or is that Rhonda the wrestler?
So I'll say I don't think that we've ever met a real Rhonda. I think when she was in the UFC, I think she was cutting pro wrestling promos then as well. And to be fair, I think all of you know the MMA world much better than I do. So maybe I'm missing something there. But I always got impressed with kind of showmanship, and it's part of why I sort of was interested in her as a mixed martial arts fighter, someone who follows it very, very casually, not religiously at all. She was one of the people I knew, and one of the people who I saw a fair number of her fights, just because I think she was just kind of a provocative personality in that way. But yeah, she made some comments about how wrestling fans were kind of disrespectful, and how it's a rigorous schedule, but at the same time, if you were actually fighting on that kind of schedule, you'd be dead. right? Because it's so much, harder on the body, is much more unpredictable, so on and so forth. I think that it was a strategically placed comment. Yeah. To what end, I'm not 100% sure. Like, is her return imminent? I don't know. I think it's certainly possible, but I generally don't know if she might just be kind of stirring things up. She has friends who are still with the company. Shayna Baszler is a fairly prominent, main roster wrestler right now. The other four horsewomen, Marina Schaefer and I'm forgetting the other one's name. Regardless, they're both in the NXT developmental system now. So, I could see her still kind of sticking her nose in, at least to that degree, and kind of supporting her friends. But to your question, I don't sincerely think that that's really her just kind of shooting off the cuff. I think that's her cutting a wrestling promo in her own way.
If it is, she did some good acting, because it did stir the public to be, I saw it on all types of media saying, look at Rhonda, how she's, she's been accepted in this world, and now she's already dismissing it. And but then I was like, this would be great. And this is what you call like a turn face.
A heel turn would probably be best. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she was. I was gonna say, I think she's always just been herself, and I kind of agree with Mike too. Like, we never know like what's the real Rhonda, right? But I, like this kind of kayfabe, like putting stage events out there as being authentic with her, and I think this is how the industry has turned a little bit too, at least with WWE as a product, is that they have the freedom now. It's like it's almost like reality just turned all the way up. So there's always a bit of truth in what people say on a wrestling stage. It's just exaggerated and turned all the way up. Is she pissed at wrestling fans? Probably. I'm pissed at wrestling fans, and I'm a wrestling fan. So it's like it's exaggerated and turned all the way up. And I think she was honest about it. I think that's what she really thinks. It was just turned all the way up. And I agree with a lot of what she said too. If it becomes something else, that's what's to be determined. And that's what I think why wrestling is a 24/7 violent soap opera, because we don't know when that's going to come to head in the squared circle right now, right? So it's, will we see her return and come back and face everybody that she's dissed? It's saying, it's like, well, I can legitimately beat you up, so you have no credibility whatsoever to even, say something to me. That's left to be determined, and that's what we all still are waiting to see kind of happen. But yeah, her saying those type of things, like, yeah, I could see exactly why she would say that. They wanted her when what was it, WrestleMania 30, when she came in and slapped Stephanie McMahon with the Rock. It was 31, yeah. From that instance, we were like, when is she going to come into wrestling? When is she going to come into wrestling? 4 or 5 years later, she comes into wrestling. I loved it, adopted in this whole, because she's always been a fan herself, right? It's just like so many of us, like we were talking about this. Like, this was her jam back as a kid, and why she was able to kind of adopt the Roddy Piper, and having the rowdy thing, and the great story that she's even, come out about, saying like it was the jacket that she wore was actually Piper's, and his son allowed her to do it. Before he passed, like, she was able to ask, like, can I use the Rowdy name, because she wanted to make sure that he was cool with it, and he was like, of course, yes. And so even that respect part of it, like, she has that, she acknowledges that. And so now coming in here and then saying, okay, that this isn't like the toughest schedule possible, right? You're on the road 300 days of the year, working, performing, having to find a gym, eating right, sleeping, maintaining some type of distant family, and then the physicality of it, and the fact that you can get hurt any single time, legitimately. It's insane. And that's something that no MMA person has been able to they've at least never denied that is a grueling schedule. And so that was the first time she saw that, and she was like, well, damn, and even then she get, when you're on the top like that, you get the perks, you get the jets, you get the cars, you get, a little bit more luxury and the leeway of not maybe having to work 5 days a week. But it's eye-opening. And I think that was part of her frustration too. Like, well, damn, I didn't know it was all this, you know what I mean? But yeah, it's left to be determined if
if that response will come, because they always say like never say never in wrestling, because everybody that's ever said like I'm never coming back now has a show. Like CM Punk on Fox now, you know, it's like, okay, it's like never say never in wrestling, because some way, shape, or form, like it'll probably happen.
And I'll just say, to draw one more parallel, I sort of feel like Brock Lesnar is to MMA what Ronda Rousey is to wrestling at this point, where he'll still show up and push. What was Daniel Cormier? Was that the guy he pushed?
Yeah.
End of an event. Just to remind you he's there, just to remind you that he could do that, and then never actually do it, right? Or not to date, but who knows, maybe he will eventually come back, right? And so I think that's what these worlds are becoming increasingly kind of.
That's what DC wanted, because he knows that would be the money fight, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen because he signed some other deal, I guess, with WWE. So now it's, I don't know, yeah. But no, it's a good point.
Can I ask a question, or are we running out of time? Should I? Okay.
I heard, but if the connection starts to get bad, just hopefully we can work around it. So keep going.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So is the thing that Ronda Rousey said that's out of bounds, the acknowledging that the fight itself is not as real as MMA? Is that what offended fans the most? Is that, so that's you can say anything as long as you don't break that illusion, like the traditional wrestler saying if someone challenges you in a bar, you have to actually have a fight. So is that what people were offended by?
She broke all the barriers.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the bigger offense, at least to me, because I think when I first read it, I sort of like everyone took it at face value, which I think is part of why it worked and why I think was, you know, to the extent that you can call such a thing successful, was successful. Is that like it was someone who's, you know, been a fan of this for 30 some odd years. I was still like, oh man, she's such a jerk. And I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
You know, and but I think it was sort of the suggestion that like this is not as hard or as respectable as a line of work, because it's not as, you know, physically punishing, as grueling, as dangerous, you know, whatever kind of adjective you want to apply there. I think that's the heart of what was there, and I think, you know, with a little sprinkling of like, by the way, it's fake, right? So just to kind of, you know, drive that in a little bit.
Right, real MMA couldn't do this, or they would be dead.
But
yeah,
brilliant. I mean, we might be overthinking everything, but the fact that, you know, I saw it, I think on the Washington Post headline, you know, that they referenced this. I have my mom saying, did you hear about Ronda Rousey? And she doesn't touch that world at all, anything. And I think, like, you're right, this is this violent fairy tale, or as you say, a soap opera is the better term, that is able to cross over. Like, I couldn't tell you about reality shows, and if someone said, like, did you hear Joe on The Bachelor, I could care less. But it's some reason, like, how it inspires us to connect. We want to know what's going on, and that's what I think is so interesting about the fact that I had the two people ask me, like, what's going on with Rhonda, you know, even though she's been out of it, or we don't know what her plan is. No, it's fascinating. And I want to kind of get some last thoughts, because I wanted to talk about geopolitics, you know, with the Saudi Arabian card. You know, there were a lot of people who did not, you know, think that was a strategic move in terms of what Saudi Arabia has, you know, human rights violations and other kind of things, and they're being paid by the government to come there. And then the whole incident that happened, I mean, that's another episode. So drug testing, is that something that's involved in this sport? So there's so much I want to kind of drill down. So we may have to just do this another time, you know, because I really want to go. But any last thoughts? Tunisha, Kyle, Mike? No? I mean, I think I said it there. There's so much to cover. Is there drug testing?
There is drug testing. The level of scrutiny it actually goes through and the consistency of it, those are big questions, right? You know, one of the stories which I accept is true. I don't know for sure that it is, but John Cena claims that when he was first, you know, kind of being considered or recruited by the company, Vince McMahon vocally rejected him and told him, get off steroids first and then we'll talk. And he took great offense to that because he's very consistently said that I was never on steroids. I'm not on steroids. It's all natural. And there is a degree to which it makes sense, right? That if there were actually people who could look like that naturally, wouldn't they end up in WWE? Like that 1 or 2% of people who can do that. I don't know for a fact. I've never been involved with the testing. I know that there's some degree of controversy of like people like Brock Lesnar don't necessarily go through that testing, right? Because they're not full-time talents. And that's why he can, come back looking like he looks, can lose 20 pounds and still be, a freak of a human being. But yeah, so at least to some degree, there is that testing. And I think at least for people who are not super well-established stars, I actually fully believe they do suspend people on a fairly regular basis. And it seems like, at least there is that level of affront about testing.
Yeah, well, and we also know the history, because I know that in the 80s when we weren't regulating, and I know that some people have had health costs due to that. So maybe, they've seen the cost of it, so they really know. Oh gosh, there's so much. Well, thank you, Mike. Everyone, it's The Long Way Home. You can get this via Amazon, and it's amazing. We want to talk about, oh, there it is. There it is. There's so many other stories that I want to go into, especially the bastard child of Andre the Giant and that whole story. So please come back, especially when we see what's going on with it. We're watching the spectacle of the spectacle, right? Of how it's being, will the public accept this new version? But Mike, where can people find you?
So my website is miketchin.com, and it's the same as my Twitter handle, just at MikeTChin. But yeah, those are the main outlets. I kind of link to everything from those places. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you. Kyle, can you tell people where they can find you?
Oh yeah, probably Twitter is the best place. I post things in there. So at Kyle the Green. So you can find me there. I should update my website, but I don't. So eventually I'll share my website, but I need that's a bit old now.
Thank you. And Tunisha?
Same on Twitter. It's at T Singleton Says. Website links kind of through there, which I need to update too. So I should probably take it off until I'm ready. But at T Singleton Says is where you can find me on Twitter, where I you never know what you're going to get. I can be live tweeting a wrestling show or an MMA event, and then, or posting something highly intellectual. So you never know what you're going to get from my Twitter account. I'm all over the place.
I recommend it highly. Yes. Yes, because you'll be posting about a program that's delving into race and basketball, and then you're excited.
And then I'll post like some ratchet meme that I thought was hilarious. So it's like I can go all over the place. That's who I am.
All worthy and all valuable. So thank you so much. And yeah, Mike, please come back. We would love to talk. Just be maybe come back for another panel where wrestling might be a topic or not. But we really appreciate your voice.
No, I'd love to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting this, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's overthink some more this weekend.
Deal.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.